Hello there. Hi. Welcome to Butterfly Effect, a podcast all about interviewing people. I'm your host, Tristan Ettleman. Before we get to that interviewing part, let's just chill out for a little bit, huh? You and I. All of you and I. Things are happening. I don't know. I can't say anything about anything, but today's been a good day in terms of opportunities. I'm just excited. It's good to feel excited about work and creating and things like that. So, yeah. Being very vague because I don't want to talk about anything yet, but this is one of those things that's going really well, this podcast. I'm having a ton of fun doing it. I'm getting tons of great guests on, and this is episode 20, so that's a pretty significant number, I guess. Today on the show, I talked to Jeff Smith, creator of comics such as Bone, RASL, Tuki, and more. He did Shazam for DC for a time, and he did the cover to Say Anything's In Defense of the Genre album. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Jeff. And Bone, his kind of landmark series that really kind of changed the face of independent and graphic novels, independent comics and graphic novels rather, is really good, and I'm a big fan of it. So I thought I'd reach out and talk to Jeff, and we had a great conversation. There's a new Bone story out right now, Bone Coda, so check that out. And yeah, Jeff's just a really cool, down-to-earth guy. And I learned a lot about the comics industry and what was going on in the 80s and 90s in terms of independent stuff and graphic novels and stuff like that. So, really interesting, cool conversation with Jeff. Will commence shortly. Alright, yeah, that's enough time. See you on the other side. So yeah, let's talk about that. The new Bone story. I hadn't. So you said you announced it yesterday. Didn't see that, but
we announced it Wednesday.
Wednesday, okay.
Yeah.
And what is it? The same characters?
Yeah, it picks up. I assume you've read Bone.
Yes. Okay. I love Bone.
It picks up right at where it leaves off. We go right to the Bone cousins riding in their little rickety cow cart with Barkley in tow.
Cool. That's exciting.
It is exciting for me anyway.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. The story just kind of came out. I was actually working on something completely else, and I started writing this story. And it's not very important to the tale. We're calling it Bone Coda because it's just sort of like a little ending piece to the story.
Well, and it's fun characters. Good to revisit it, basically, and
just get to spend a little time with them again, being with the boys.
Yeah. Well, you've worked on other stuff since then, of course. Have you felt like kind of this longing to go back to Bone?
Oh, not in the sense that I wanted to, ever do like a giant Moby Dick-sized sequel again, but yeah, a few times I found little excuses to draw the characters.
Yeah. Well, where are you from, Jeff?
Ohio. Grew up in Columbus, which is where I am now. Yeah. And traveled quite a bit. Although my wife and I did live in Northern California for a few years. She had a job in a software company in Silicon Valley in the early 90s.
Right. Yeah, that's really, I imagine cost of living is way higher in Northern California than it is in
my goodness, yeah,
in Columbus. But so how was it growing up in Columbus? I'm not really familiar with Ohio in general. I have a few friends that live there.
Where are you at?
I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. So I'm not really familiar with anything further east than this. I mean, I've been to New York and stuff like that, but that's West Coast is my wheelhouse, basically.
I spent quite a bit of time in Tucson.
Okay.
I did a story called RASL, which is a science fiction story about a guy that worked in basically a Raytheon type place. Oh. So I spent a few weeks out there. My brother-in-law lives out there. Anyway, Columbus, Ohio is it's a fairly large city. It's probably, when you include the suburbs and everything, it's 2 million people.
Wow.
If you're just driving on Route 70, from either direction, this giant bunch of skyscrapers just show up on the horizon out of the middle of nowhere. It was a very nice place to grow up, I think. And it's really changed in like the last 15 years, where it's become very foodie. I mean, heading towards a Portland type thing.
Sure.
I grew up on the north end, but then there's like a little enclave just south of downtown called German Village that never really got updated after like the 40s. So there's like still some gas lamps around, and the streets are all cobblestone, and it's a lot of brick. And when I moved down here in the late 70s to go to art school downtown, it was just like all bohemian, a bunch of art students. There's a big gay population down here. It was fun. It was a good time to be down here.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Was there kind of an art scene going on in Columbus? And it sounds like there was.
There was an art college. The Columbus College of Art and Design is a pretty well-respected national college. I know Disney was recruiting out of there for years and years. And now we have a really booming art scene. We have like a little part of town that has galleries and a lot of local artists. Vijaya and I, our house is like filled with all local artists' work.
Awesome.
We just love it. No bone in the house at all. No comic books, but tons of local artists.
Yeah. Well, I always ask that question about where people grow up and like kind of what the vibe was, because I'm in Phoenix, and there's an art scene here, of course, right? And there's there is in any city,
right?
But I feel like there's not really a sense of like there's a lot of creative stuff to do here. You know what I mean? Like you got to go somewhere else to find that kind of work.
Well, that's the way every place was.
Sure.
Before the internet.
Yeah, of course. Well, of course, yeah. Well, and something that you do, of course, you can be, since you're kind of in charge of your own stuff, you can kind of be wherever you need to be. But, it's always been like the coasts, I guess, California, just New York or something. But
just in the 70s, you had to be in New York if you wanted to be in the comic book business.
Right.
It was only just in the 80s and 90s where independent publishers and self-publishers, crazy people like me, started doing their own stuff, and we had the tools. We had FedEx, we had fax machines, we had email. That didn't exist, just before that. So it was really fun and kind of dangerous.
Yeah. Well, when you were coming up as a kid in high school and to college, what were you consuming? What were you reading and watching and stuff that kind of, what was your stuff? What were your favorite things?
What was my stuff? I was always big on comic strips.
Sure.
Collections of like Doonesbury and Pogo and Peanuts. Doonesbury was one of my main things. I would drag these giant oversized paperbacks around every apartment I moved to on campus. I read a lot of big books. I was really into Moby Dick. For real. That's not just a joke.
Yeah, that wasn't just a joke. I remember seeing something about you being actually a huge fan of Moby Dick, and of course that made its way into Bone. But
yeah, and I loved the Iliad and the Odyssey. I loved Morte d'Arthur by Mallory. Mark Twain. I loved Huckleberry Finn. So that's the kind of stuff I was reading. And then the summer in between my junior year and my senior year of high school, it was 1977. Somebody talked me into reading The Lord of the Rings for the first time. A really good friend who just loved it and been bugging me for years. I finally gave in and I read it, and wow, that was pretty good. But the other thing, there are two other things that happened that same summer. Heavy metal came out, which was the early heavy metal was all these French language artists like Mobius and Bilal and all these crazy guys. So heavy metal came out, and it was this mind-blowing, grown-up fantasy comics done just incredibly well.
Yeah.
And the third thing was Star Wars came out that summer, the first Star Wars movie. So I was 17, and my head exploded.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was kind of where Bone started to. I started to want to see comic strip like characters that I had been drawing. I had made up the little Bone Cousins, was trying to do a Doonesbury like comic strip with a, but I wanted to add this fantasy kind of Tolkien, Star Wars, heavy metal vibe to it, or world building, and it took me a long time to really get serious about it, but. That was really the moment, like 1977. I really kind of pulled all my comics and my crazy fable worlds together and to make Bone.
Yeah, well, the way you mentioned Peanuts and Lord of the Rings, I can totally see that now of Bone being like this clash between those two worlds. Like, I can totally see that. And I'm a huge Peanuts fan personally too. Like, I think it's like so. Brilliant, but
it is so.
And same with Lord of the Rings in its own way, in its different way, and that makes sense. Well, so you were working on stuff. You were doing like these comic strips. You said you were just messing around, just drawing stuff, and you before the stuff came out.
Yeah, I always drew. I mean, I loved cartoons. I loved all kind of cartoons, whether it was Peanuts in the newspaper or Uncle Scrooge or Batman comic books. I loved collecting comic books when I was, like 10, 9 and 10 years old. Back then, you were allowed to ride your bike off of your parents' property without a helmet on. We used to go all over the city, me and my buddies, looking for comic books. Because now there's comic book stores, and if you just want a comic book, you can just go. It'll be there. You can even have them save it for you, pull it for you if you want. But back then, it was really pretty haphazard and random what issues of comic books would show up. So if there was a story in Batman that you really wanted to read or an artist you wanted to follow, it might not be there. It just might show up or they sold out or whatever. So we'd have to go all over the city looking for the comics we wanted to collect. So that was a big part of comic books, was that kind of community and friendship of the hobby that you have with friends. And let's see, animated cartoons. Loved Bugs Bunny and all the shows pre Scooby Doo. I love that kind of stuff. So it was, even as a little kid, I just drew to keep myself busy. It was always fun. I don't think I took it seriously really until sometime after that one moment where Star Wars and heavy metal and everything collided.
77, yeah. It's a big year.
It was for me, anyway.
Yeah.
Well, it was kind of big. It was a big deal for everybody, really.
Yeah, exactly. That's why, just in general, I feel like that year, because there's some other, I can't think off the top of my head, but I mean, that kind of changed the nerd culture and the, the way people talked about that kind of stuff.
Absolutely.
Star Wars specifically, but other stuff too.
Yes.
But so what did you go to college for? You went to art school.
Yeah, I went to art school. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I kind of, in high school, was not very serious about anything. I kind of was the drawer guy in high school.
Yeah.
So the teachers, I had a couple really good teachers in high school. The rest just wanted to throw me out of the building.
Yeah.
But the good ones actually kind of steered me toward this scholarship at this art college. And I went, and I wasn't really fully invested. And at some point, I realized, I guess at this art school, here's what it was. At this art school, two pathways. You could be a fine artist, which in 1978 was bullshit. The fine arts were just like, it was throw spit and glue and sticks at a canvas and justify. It was horrible. Yeah. And the other was commercial, where you learned how to lovingly render Bic razors with gouache or colored pencil, and I just didn't fit. Of course, now that school and many schools actually have comics majors.
Of course, yeah.
But at the time, I thought, well, this isn't really working for me. If I want to do that's when I decided I am going to be serious about comics. And across town at OSU, at the Ohio State University, they had a student newspaper there that came out 5 days a week, had like 50,000 readers.
Wow.
And I went there, and they said you could be in the paper if you enroll as a journalism student. And so that's what I did. I went over to OSU and started a little version of kind of a pre-Bone this comic strip.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple friends that just graduated from OSU.
Yeah?
For journalism, yeah.
Journalism, no kidding.
Yeah. But yeah, so what was that strip? What was that called again?
Well, it was called Thorn.
Okay, right.
But it was the same basic premise, but because it was called Thorn because Phone Bone was in love with her. Mm-hmm. But it was the same idea: the three cartoon cousins that stumble into a kind of a fairy tale world with princesses and monsters and all the same kind of stuff that's in Bone. But it didn't have a story. It was just sort of a fish out of water, gag a day joke.
Sure.
But as I went on, I started thinking, there should be a story. There should be a story to this. And then I kind of got this idea, like, that would be cool. If you could do a comic strip, and I could somehow get the soul of Peanuts, the lush artwork that's in, like, Walt Kelly's Pogo. I don't know if you remember that strip.
I'm vaguely familiar with it. Yeah.
It's beautiful. If you look at it, you'll just see I'm trying so hard and failing to draw that. And then the character development of Doonesbury stretched to the breaking point where it actually was a comic strip that had a beginning and a middle and an end.
Yeah, a narrative.
A true narrative, but disguise it as like a gag-a-day strip, like Doonesbury, but really plan the ending and just go. And I talked to so many newspaper syndicate editors, and I showed them my strips, and they're not that great, but they were good enough that the editors were talking to me and saying, you really should continue this. But they hated the idea of this big story. They really pushed back against that, and they also really thought, why don't you get rid of all this fantasy stuff and the humans and the dragons and just do the bones? Yeah. And I spent about 2 years trying to break into the newspaper comic strip business, but nobody was buying it. And I was getting disheartened because I talked to these editors, and they would make suggestions like, why don't you have the bones talk to each other in thought balloons? And I thought, why? And they said, because Garfield talks in thought balloons, and Garfield was very popular at the time, still is.
Yeah.
But that was discouraging because, that just means that the gatekeepers of the field I loved so much didn't even understand how comics work.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
like they wanted to look like Garfield and even like the weirdest detail.
But if they're talking in thought balloons, I couldn't even look at this guy. It's like they can't hear each other.
Exactly.
Well, so that was very discouraging. And then around that time, I was taking a class at OSU with Lucy Caswell, who's now the founding curator of the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. But she had started it back then. And have you heard of that?
No, that name sounds really familiar.
All right. So the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library Museum is probably the largest, and in my opinion, the best collection of comics, papers, and original artwork in the world. And I know because I've been to most of them, if not. I've been to them in Angoulême, France. I've been to them in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian. And this is just hands down the most astonishing thing for a cartoonist to go into this library and say, I'd like to look at a George Harriman Crazy Cat or a Winsor McCay Little Nemo and Slumberland. And they bring out the original artwork that these guys, were working on 100 years ago.
That's awesome.
And they're just gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. And there's something kind of magical about touching the piece of paper that was actually touched by the artist.
Yeah.
It's that same feeling you get when you're in a museum and you're 6 inches away from a painting. It's different than looking at it in a magazine,
Right.
So anyway, I was taking a class with this woman. She taught a little class about comics, and at that time, the only graphic novel that existed that I know of was Will Eisner's A Contract with God.
Okay.
Which in the world of comics, that's a fairly well known.
Yeah. I know Eisner kind of created the graphic novel.
And that was it. That was the one he did it with, and he'd only done the one at the time.
Yeah.
And it was 1986, and Art Spiegelman came and gave a talk to this little classroom. And it was just, it couldn't have been more than 12 or 15 students. And he was telling us, he was telling us about Raw magazine, which is something he and his wife were doing in New York City. It was this big, oversized, super design heavy, artsy comic magazine. It was kind of like you could see him on newsstands. It was sort of like based on Andy Warhol's Interview, which was very popular at the time. And he was telling us, he used to work for Topps Bubblegum Company, and he designed the Wacky Packages and the Garbage Pail Kids. And so, of course, he's got a lot of cred with me already. And then he starts talking about this new book he's just done called Mouse. And he showed us, he had a little PowerPoint, and he had some examples. And I remember thinking, this is interesting. I'm digging this graphic novel idea.
Yeah.
And I left that classroom, and I walked across the street to the college bookstore and bought, Mouse, the first printing of it. And I went home and read it, and that was like 1977, but 10 years later. This is
another 77 moment.
Yeah, this is another 77 moment, and that's when I started to really think, maybe comic strips. I can't go there, but here's somebody who's actually done the idea of having a beginning and a middle and an end, and it's in a book form. Pretty good.
Yeah,
rambling, or am I starting to just?
No, you're totally making sense. No, and I that makes sense that you said that, because that kind of alternative comics movement that was going on throughout those years, I can totally see how you could have been influenced by that, or how that kind of played into your story. Because someone showed me Mouse when I was in high school, and I'm like, this is cool, and I'm like, and I didn't realize, I thought it was a relatively new thing, but this was like, when it came out, it was not like, it was not common practice for a comic book to be like that.
Yeah, no, it was it was not common practice for a comic to get written up, in New York literary journals and in newspapers across the country. And,
of course.
That was shocking. At the same time, Frank Miller's Dark Knight came out and was getting written up in the paper. In the Sunday magazine section of the Columbus Dispatch, there was an article about this new Batman comic. Yeah. And I thought, okay, that's bizarre. So I found a comic book shop. Never heard of them before. Like I said, to me, getting a comic book meant you had to get on your little Stingray and ride to the drugstore. So I found a comic book store down near campus, and it was that alternative movement that was going on that you're talking about saved me, because I didn't know what to do with the newspaper strips. And I walk into this store, and I did get Frank Miller's comic book, which I did like a lot. But what blew my mind was seeing Dan Clow's 8-Ball and Jaime Hernandez, the Hernandez brothers, Love and Rockets, and Cerebus by Dave Sim and Gerhard. And Raw magazine was there. And I thought, what the heck? And back then there were two comics, like trade magazines. One was called the Comics Journal, and one was called Comics Buyer's Guide. The Comics Journal kind of represented this alternative movement, the sort of serious, literate comic side of that existed, and it came out once a month. And the Comics Buyer's Guide was sort of the more traditional comics collecting.
Sure.
What's going on with Marvel and DC and all that. And that came out every week. And I had no idea that this universe existed. And that Comics Buyer's Guide was the web of the day. Because people would write letters, and we didn't have the web to go be snarky on. People would be so freaking snarky in the letters columns. They were great. Great battles went on in the letters pages of the Comics Journal and the Comics Buyer's Guide.
Yeah, you got to give them some credit for publishing that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was the community. It was the same kind of idea, but it was just slower.
Yeah, right. Well, and what you say this is 86? Wasn't that Watchmen too? I mean, I know that's not necessarily like obscure or anything, but it was definitely obscure. It was a big deal.
That was I've often referred to it as the Big Bang for graphic novels.
Sure.
In 1986, you had Mouse, you had Watchmen, you had Dark Knight Returns, and you also had the first big Cerebus collection that Dave Sim put out. People forget that came out the same year. And I definitely took notice and thought, this is where it's going.
Yeah.
Books. Comic books actually shaped like books.
Yeah.
I thought that was badass. And so it's so commonplace now, but it was not back then.
No, yeah. Well, it's funny because all these things are pretty different in tone to your stuff, or at least Bone. But the stuff you're mentioning obviously is the more influential part of the fact that these things are telling narratives and that they're, self-contained, like you said, books.
And the most important thing, which is why I don't see much difference between 8-Ball and Bone, because to me what's important is that they're owned and controlled by the creators, which is the main thing. And of course, tonally and the art and everything, they're completely different pieces, but we're different authors.
Of course.
So when you have Marvel and DC or Archie or Disney or anything, it's pretty much a corporate-controlled character that people are hired to write. And not that there's no artists that haven't come out of those trenches. There sure have. Kirby, Neil Adams, all those.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, lots. But you know what I mean. To me, what was interesting was this other side of comics where I saw books that were done by people with a voice, with something to say, a story they wanted to tell, and that was very exciting for me.
Yeah, and of course that's a great movement now. There's so much great creator-owned stuff out there now too. Like, I had someone on here, Joey Esposito.
Yeah,
he's an up-and-coming comic writer, and he's written some great stuff. I don't know. I just feel like that movement it's been around for a little bit, but it's growing now with the internet.
Oh yeah, and there was pushback from the industry, especially when we started the self-publishing movement. And we would go to like there used to be a whole lot of comic book distributors, but the two biggest were a company called Diamond, which is still around, and another one called Capital. And stop me if I'm getting too inside baseball here.
No, I love it.
Okay. Diamond and Capital were the two biggies, and they were kind of the rivals. And they would each, once a year, have a big retailer event where retailers from all over the country would fly in and spend the whole weekend, and all the publishers would have events and parties and come to this room at this time, and DC's going to make their big announcements, sort of like you see at San Diego with the Hollywood movies doing.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I remember I didn't know anybody. I went to the show. I'm a publisher, right? I got a little booth and had a piece of art to paperclip to an easel. But I didn't know anybody, didn't know any cartoonists, didn't know anybody. So I went to all these events, and I remember seeing DC saying, "Hey, we're going to have this new Batman animated show, and we're going to show you the first episode."
Oh, man.
And I'll tell you what, that audience of all male geeks went nuts.
I mean, that show. I mean, we're talking about animated series, right?
The first, yeah.
Okay.
That was the first time anybody'd seen it. It was so much fun. But that was what the kind of event was. And I think at that first one, I'd done like 3 issues, and I'd not heard from anybody. It's a lot of work doing a comic book, and it's even with my wife Vijaya helping me with the business side, still everything had to be done by hand back then. No Photoshop, so even doing covers meant you had to do the cover, you had to create overlays to paste mechanical logos down, and all the lettering was done with chart pack. I can't even believe I did
all the work you did.
Oh my God, Photoshop now. We just did the cover. It took us about half an hour. So at that show though, a couple of things happened that kind of changed the trajectory for me. Like I wasn't quite sure if this was really going to work, even as a hobby or because I love it, because it just wasn't selling. But I was out on the show floor, and I remember Don and Maggie Thompson, who were the editors of this Comics Buyer's Guide that I was telling you about, came around the corner, and I'd seen them around the show, and I knew who they were. And I saw them see my little drawing that I had clipped on the easel, and I kid you not, they looked at each other, smiled, grabbed each other's hands, and almost were skipping like little. And they had seen my books, and they were real big Walt Kelly Pogo fans, and they got it, and they just completely charmed me to death. They were wonderful. And they spent almost the rest of the convention bringing people over and introducing me to important retailers, and they gave me we set up a deal where they would run like 9 pages of the next issue of Bone as a preview, and gave me like 3 full pages in this magazine that was the Bible of the industry.
Right.
And at the same time, the Comics Journal for issue number 4 ran the cover and blurbed it. And so that was like, oh my God, both sides of the industry liked this book.
Yeah.
That was a huge relief.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that synthesis of the kind of the narrative that you were talking about in the comic strip gag-a-day thing you were going for initially of it's funny and it's got this kind of epic tale going on.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that would probably hit both audiences.
It's very cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're doing all this self-publishing stuff, but were you what was the timeline after college? Did you finish out? Did you graduate?
No, I went for 4 years. And I almost had enough credits to be a sophomore. I didn't quite make it. Basically, I was a journalism student just so I could be in the paper.
Right.
And I took a lot of racquetball. I took some art classes. I took just enough to keep my status up so that I could be in the paper. I had no interest really in much else. Oh, and Lucy and the Cartoon Library Museum was that was my world. I would go there at lunch. It was much smaller then, a little less formal. I mean, now it's this giant 100-year-old building right on the gateway to campus, and it's absolutely beautiful. I hope you get to see it sometime.
I would love to, yeah. It'd be awesome.
but back then it was just on the ground floor of the journalism building in like 2 classrooms. And I just used to go down there and hang out. And they'd get new pieces of art, they'd show them to me, or I would just read like old collections of Thimble Theater and Popeye and Crazy Cat. So that's what my college years were mostly like back then, was racquetball and looking at original artwork.
Old comics.
In the library.
It's a good existence.
I was happy. I was very happy.
So what'd you do after that? Were you were you devoted fully to Bone?
Well,
or Thorn? Or?
Around the time I had done 4 years, I had been trying for a while to get the newspaper syndicates interested in doing a comic strip of this, and that just didn't work. And there was a point where I just got discouraged and said, you know what, forget it. That ain't going to happen. So that was around the time I was, finishing up spending 4 years. Well, Vijaya graduated, so I didn't see any reason to stick around anymore. And I did meet some buddies at the university that were interested in animation, and that was kind of fun. So we started up a little animation studio. We knew some people in the media business, so we were able to get little jobs doing PSAs, animated PSAs. We worked on some commercials. So that's what we did. I started up a little animation studio called Character Builders with 2 friends, and did that for 7 or 8 years, and grew. It grew until we would get like 15 minutes of a feature film to complete. I remember we worked on Bebe's Kids. Reginald Hudlin was the director, and they would send us the storyboards and say, do the animation for these sequences, and that was very fun and was pretty good money. Yeah, when we had money, that was a real feast or famine situation.
Well, I imagine like it's not as, I don't know if you would describe it as freelance, but it seems like work for hire kind of situations, or stuff where you're like, when the work's coming in, you're on top of the world, and then it can go the other way too.
Yeah, you got 3 artists running the business, and we're all working night and day to get the animation done, and then it's done, and then you're like, well, time to put the suit on and go visit the ad agencies again.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So you were burning the midnight oil there, it sounds like, and then and then were you still kind of kicking around the Thorn or the Bone idea at the same time?
I was
self-publishing that.
That was when I was finding comic book stores.
Okay.
So I was learning about comics. I was also, had done the comic strip in college, which didn't have a story. It just had the fish out of water jokes with, here are these guys that are used to having money and now they don't have money. They have to barter for eggs and stuff. Yeah. And that had a limited amount of places I could take it. Anyway, I started trying to read the books I liked, take them apart. I read Moby Dick like 3 times. Obviously very different in tone, but I wanted that kind of a story that was multi-leveled like an onion. So I had to really understand it. I had to understand epics. I began to, the Star Wars movie or the Tolkien book. I wanted to read what turned them on. What turned on George Lucas? What turned on Tolkien? Yeah. And I got into. They both kind of led me into Celtic myths,
Yeah, I was going to say maybe some Joseph Campbell.
Oh, absolutely.
In Lucas's case.
Yeah. No, that, and then, but ultimately Joseph Campbell leads you to the source material, which is the myths itself.
Yeah.
And I really got into that. And my wife is Indian, so I explored Indian mythology. We'd go to India, and in India, the religion is so much more casual. There's shrines everywhere. Yeah. There's nothing oppressive to it, at least to me as an outsider experiencing it. The gods are everywhere. And the mythology was really interesting to me, and eventually a lot of that would make its way into I'd use some of that as in Bone. Difficult to explain. Like at the end, the great giant mother dragon, Queen Dragon. She's the creator and the destroyer. That's a very Indian concept.
Sure. Okay. But you were working on this stuff and trying to pitch it around, basically. What was or were you just like, okay, I'm going to start making this? Because what year did you officially start doing Bone? Like
the first comic book was July 1991, so it'll be 25 years in July.
Wow.
And I think in 89 is when the light bulb really went off. And I was like, you know what? I need to do this. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
89 because I was 29 years old. I was going to be 30 the next year. And I was like, I wasn't doing, the comic strip didn't work. I'm like, you know what? I got one more shot at this. I'm going to try it in this kind of underground comic book world.
Mm-hmm.
And in 89, I started working on the plan. I talked to Vijaya. She was very helpful in like just saying, well, be serious. Write a business plan out. Explain what you're going to do and where you're going to be in 5 years and how the money comes in and what, like a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And I was a little used to that because I'd been running this company for a few years.
Right.
But that was very, very helpful to really think that through. And then also really kind of committing to what is the ending. I wrote the ending first and then kind of worked back about 3 or 4 tent poles that would prop up the story and take place at moments when I knew the characters would have to make some big decision to make the story move to the next section. Mm-hmm. So I had that all figured out. I think I remember even then the only graphic novels that stayed in print were Watchmen, Dark Knight, and Mouse. Yeah. But I remember writing in my business plan that we took to a bank to try to get a loan. I had a line in there that said, each issue will be part of a larger chapter. It will be a new chapter to this larger story and contain clues. And once a year, we'll collect them in graphic novels. And I remember I actually put quotations around graphic novels. If you didn't work in comics, you wouldn't have heard that term.
Yeah.
And that way we would keep the early chapters available for new readers and maintain a more of a presence on store shelves.
Sure.
And in fact, we did do that.
Yeah. Well, how long did it run?
I think 13 years, but I kind of took a year at one point to work on a screenplay and do 2 prequels to Bone.
Right. Yeah. There was the one that had like they were kind of side stories, or I can't think of the name.
Yeah. It was. It's now Scholastic publishes it as Bone Tall Tales.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and speaking of the Scholastic thing, how did that that reinvigorate? Because that was many years later.
Well,
that reinvigorate.
It was it started in 91 and ended in 2004.
Sure.
And I think most people in comics by that time knew that I was coming to the end.
Uh-huh.
And like when DC Comics called at that time and asked if I wanted to do Shazam after that. And at the same time, Scholastic called. And which was ironic to us because we'd been trying to get a real publisher to pick up Bone for years. Vijay and I had. We were convinced that there were more readers for comics than what was going into comic book stores.
Sure.
Because it was really mostly 20 to 40-year-old guys.
Yeah.
And we knew women would read comics. There were women reading comics, but not as many as there could have been, and hardly any, really.
Yeah.
We thought kids would read these books, so we would try to get into libraries, but no library system would touch it for 2 reasons. One, it was a comic, and 2, it was self-published, and those were absolutely unacceptable. Same, we couldn't get on Amazon. You couldn't get comics on Amazon back then. And then all of a sudden, Scholastic calls and says, the librarians are telling us that they're getting these on their shelves. And kids are buying them or checking them out like crazy, and we want to launch a graphic novel imprint through Scholastic, and we want to launch it with Bone. And we thought, well, we were suspicious at first, but they really did understand what they were talking about. Like, we talked to some other mainstream publishers like Harper or Collins, and I don't remember who it was, but that said, they basically wanted to treat them like specialty books. They weren't real books. Like there was like a really messy little shelf where there were some fangraphic books, but they were just like with the Dungeons and Dragons, and our books were there too. We kind of skipped when we were able to finally break out of the comic book store, but we don't have to talk about that. So Scholastic was like, we're gonna just treat it like it's a regular book. We're gonna put it on the bookshelves in the kids section right next to Harry Potter, and just treat it like a book. And they wanted to color it, and it didn't take too long to convince us. They did eventually convince us. We went to see them in New York, and they were really great people. I almost feel like family with them now. But it was a good idea, and they pulled it off really well.
Yeah, and I feel like you mentioned, it opened it up to a whole new audience that wasn't just the in-the-know comic readers.
Yeah, it was a whole new level of readership. It was so much more real world, mainstream in the most real sense, because they have those book fairs, and so it's kids really just reading them, and every single year there's a new crop of kids coming through there.
Yeah.
And Vijay and I kept the rights to the color itself and just licensed it to Scholastic for North America. And we launched a big tour. We had a lot of foreign publishers already, and we just said, hey, we're going to do this new color version. We planned this gigantic, 3-month-long tour of Europe where we simultaneously launched in 17 languages. And
wow.
It was pretty cool. Yeah, it was a whole new thing. Whole new thing for Bone, new readers, very different readers.
Yeah.
And kids.
Yeah.
I mean, comics are back in the hands of kids thanks to Scholastic and manga for the first time in a generation.
Yeah. Yeah, the industry was kind of trending towards darker and more adult, which there's obviously still that element, of course. But
well, it is, and it was shrinking.
Yeah.
Because they weren't really getting. There's no new kids coming in.
Yeah.
But that's changing, and it's been that's probably the biggest change I've seen in the industry since I started was women and children, probably, and graphic novels.
Yeah, which were probably tied in some ways.
I think they are. I've always toured. I've always enjoyed women, and I've always tried to promote. That sounds so patronizing. I've always enjoyed comics by women, and I've always looked that they were doing them, and I wanted more comics for women and by women.
Yeah. Well, it is an industry dominated by men, so I think it makes sense that you'd say that you enjoy a different voice.
Yes, and it represents 50% of the audience.
Yeah,
and that it was certainly that 50% was missing, and all throughout the early '90s, anyway.
Right. So you said DC had called and said, "Hey, you want to do Shazam?"
Oh,
you did Shazam, right?
And I did, yeah.
Yeah, how'd that go?
It was fun. It was fun. It was good for me. I was working on RASL, but it hadn't quite come together yet. And I didn't. That's what I wanted to do after Bone. I started thinking about this idea of this guy who could hide and jump back and forth through parallel dimensions and meet his friends and close relationships and have totally different lives with them in these parallel universes. But the story hadn't come together yet, and Bone was coming to an end. And the ending of Bone was difficult. It was just so big.
Yeah.
12 years of story threads that I wanted to pulled together and have it feel organic and natural.
Right.
That was rough. I sweated that one out. You'd think you'd have the ending all worked out, and then you'd think, God, this is it. It's perfect. Yeah. And you go, oh, wait, I forgot. There's this one really important thing, and you completely forgot it, and it doesn't fit anywhere else. So you have to.
I find beginnings and endings are the hardest thing for me to write, but.
Yeah. So that was very difficult, and Bone was a big deal. It was a big deal in comics. It was a big deal for me. It changed my life.
Yeah.
And it was kind of good that DC offered me like this little mini series on a character that definitely had my kind of style to it, my vibe. So I could do Captain Marvel, who was interesting to me because he hadn't really been made over super gritty. I think there had been a couple attempts, but I was free to just go right back to that golden age source material and kind of figure out what it was that made him appeal to kids. And he had a talking tiger. I mean, how much better is that? So for me, it was a way to kind of get out from the mindset that I'd been in with Bone for 12 years and not having to feel any pressure to do a good Shazam story, you know? So it was really nice. It was a really good 2-year period where I could do something and kind of shake myself out and get ready for a new project.
Yeah. And that next project was RASL?
And that next project was RASL, which took 5 years.
Yeah.
It was 500 pages long, and was exactly what I wanted to do. I really enjoyed it. And Vijaya, who's my business partner and wife, and who is also someone who I've always bounced everything off of, and she just loved RASL. She just loved the story, the characters, everything. So we both had fun doing that.
Yeah. And what was the kind of... you said that idea had kind of been forming towards the end of Bone. Like, what kind of what was the angle at first? What was the
early on? Have you read RASL?
Yeah, I haven't read all of it. I've read
the original idea. It's a very kind of like what do you call that? I'm thinking of like noir, but I'm hard boiled. It's very hard boiled. Story with a Clint Eastwoody maverick character. Yeah. I mean, he's not very Clint Eastwoody, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But he started off, the original idea was it was going to be much more cartoony. He almost looked like a little manga cartoon character, which is that's the remnants of that is his hair. He's got that big, giant, ridiculous hair, which is how they draw it in manga. Yeah. And I can't remember. I think the original idea was, and this was in 2000, he was going to wake up in our world and try to warn his friends, some of them who weren't his friends in this world. His wife was married to somebody else in this world. But he's going to try to tell them that terrorists are going to bomb buildings in New York City, and that they had to do something about these fundamentalist terrorists. And then that was the original idea. And then, of course, a year later, 9/11 happened, and I was like, well, that would have been really freaky if I'd have done it. Yeah, I didn't do it, and that is not what I wanted to do at that point.
Sure. Yeah.
So then it slowly I worked on the story and you know, again, read a lot of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and watched a bunch of Humphrey Bogart movies, and I got the mood and I got the understanding of how shadows angle and slash through people's faces, at the right times. And it just slowly developed. The characters came out, and then when I really wanted to sell it to myself, to really feel like I knew the ending was going to take place in the desert, and it was going to be a fight to the death. There was this super high technology going on throughout the whole book, but I wanted it to have a very primal, old school feel. Like even this high tech technology looks like a beatable jet engine.
Sure.
I went out to the desert. I went down to Tucson, hung out in the Sonoran Desert for 2 weeks.
Oh man!
And there was no sound out there. It was you're surrounded by all the saguaros and the bones of saguaros. I love those. And you can't hear anything except insects.
Yeah.
And occasionally a bird swooping overhead or something. And I just sat on this giant freaking rock and pulled out my notebook, and I pulled the whole thing together. I knew exactly how it was going to end. I knew the love triangle. It wasn't really a love triangle, but the triangle between our hero, a femme fatale, and someone who's chasing whatever he had to get. And it was there that I came up with, what are they after? What are they after? They go to parallel universes. They're all chasing through parallel universes. And I'd never heard of Tesla before. And that's when I discovered Tesla. Somebody turned me on to the Philadelphia experiment, and the whole rabbit hole opened up, and it just fit perfectly with this story I was trying to tell.
Yeah, that's a great idea. This little image in my head of you just sitting out on this rock and then it all just coming to you all at once.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if since the desert there is nothing.
Yeah.
There's not even moisture. I wondered if that vacuum just allowed all your thoughts just escape because they had nothing to hold them in.
Maybe I should try that.
Yeah,
because I live here, but I don't go out of the city ever, so maybe I should try that.
It's pretty sweet. Sweet.
Well, you're talking about this kind of primal stuff, and then you did Tuki. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah, Tuki. Bone was my love of comic strips and fantasy, and RASL was my love of physics and noir movies.
Sure.
Tuki I have just as much passion for human evolution and paleontology and all of that, and I'm fascinated by. There's a couple of time periods when very important exoduses were made out of Africa. Mm-hmm. And the one that really interested me is, just go back before there was anyone in America. There was no indigenous people in America or anywhere, or in Asia or Europe.
Yeah.
Only in Africa, and there were multiple species. Lucy, that Australopithecus,
right,
and Homo habilis and Homo erectus, and only one survived, and that was Homo erectus, who continued to evolve. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that's a cool story. I want to meet those characters, and that was kind of where the origin of that came from. Yeah.
Well, it's a great premise for a story, as you mentioned, and it's great because you do all these different things, right? You're saying that Bone was your love of comics and fantasy, and then RASL was the hard-boiled kind of sci-fi angle, and then now totally just strip it down. It's just
strip it down. Well, it kind of goes back to your comment about the two things that are hard at the beginning and the end. Yeah. And I had a lot of trouble with the ending of Bone and RASL, even though I knew what the endings were. Getting all these crazy pieces to work that had bubbled up over years. Yeah. With Tuki, I'm having trouble with the beginning. I thought this is so much fun. I want to get there. I want to start meeting these characters, and I have really grown to like these characters. I love them. I love Tuki. Mm-hmm. I love the little kids that are. He's kind of got under his wing now, and this crazy old Homo habilis character. But what's happened is I've gotten to know the characters. And the story, I know how the story ends. I figured that out. I always do that first.
Yeah.
But kind of some of the tent poles that I had thought of I all of a sudden, that's not the story anymore. The story still ends the same way, but there's a different story that just kind of revealed itself to me over the 2 years that I've been kind of putting them up online. So I am going to, since I can, I'm going to take the pages, rework it, and I'm going to relaunch the story because there's some things I want to do different in the beginning, and I know what the story is now.
Wow, that's awesome. It's good, and I think the main theme here is that you, like you said, because I can, you have this. You're kind of. I think you're kind of this figure in creator-owned comics.
I used to get a lot. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say because of, initially Bone was like the big thing, but now you do your own projects from then on. You're just independent. Yeah,
I used to get teased, or in some cases actually chided for making changes to the comics when I would collect them into the graphic novels. Because back then graphic novels were rarely kept in print, but they usually were. Treasuries, to so to speak. This is this comic, this special storyline from the Avengers or whatever. That is, people want it to remember it exactly the way it was. But that wasn't what comic books were to me and some of the other people at that time, like Neil Gaiman, who was working on Sandman. We were seeing these as something very important that is going to keep your work not only available but always on the shelf. Because in regular comic books, your stuff came off the shelf as soon as the new issue came out. Right. And collectors could buy it, and that was it. We wanted to stay on the shelf like in a bookstore. So that was kind of a radical idea. And then for me to go, hey, I kind of got people didn't really get that one joke that I did, so I'm just going to go back and redraw that so that the joke will be funnier or something like that, or somebody didn't. I know a better way to do it, and I would add a page that would just change the pacing and fix it, in my opinion. Yeah. Oh, more people thought that was cheating or something, or that's not cool, or I'm trying to trick them into buying the graphic novel. Yeah. But all it was for me was the comic book was like opening night of a new play. And sure. The writers and the producers are there making notes because they're going to fix that. Yeah. See what does the audience laugh at? What do they not laugh at? That kind of stuff. So ultimately, I think you came out of it and everyone appreciates your vision. I hope so. And just you can only hope, man. Yeah. Well, I think that is the case. Just as a final note, I noticed that you did, because I do pretty minimal research, I'm sorry to say, but I did discover that you did and I realized it's the cover for Say Anything's In Defense of the Genre album. Yeah. And I love that band. And I didn't realize that was you. Yeah. How was that? Was it a fun experience? It was a great experience. Because Max Bemis is a comics writer now. Yeah. He's into comics. He was a comics fan. He was really fun to talk to. I liked the band too. So yeah, I can't remember if he called or wrote. Probably emailed is how it started. Sure. But yeah, he explained the premise of the album, In Defense of the Genre, and he wanted to see old people and babies fighting, and then I just took it from there. That's awesome. I would do it a little differently now. I'd do a lot more of some more bigger characters in there, but can't. It's a great album cover. I don't have control to go back and redo that. No, of course not. Yeah. Thanks, man. Well, Jeff, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I learned a lot about comics because I'm a big comics fan, but that alternative scene is something that I'm really interested in. Even going back to I know it's very different, but Crumb and that kind of stuff. It's all part of it. I believe that side of it, we all have it in our DNA. It goes from Disney and Crazy Cat George Harriman up through Mad Magazine with Kurtzman and Will Eisner and through Crumb, and we all have that same DNA. Yeah. Well, great work. I love Bone. I love RASL. I've read a little bit of Tuki as well, and I'm excited to see what you do next. I got to check out Bone Coda. Yeah, coming out in July, man.
Awesome.
Well,
where
thank
can
you.
people
That
find?
was great talking to you. It was fun.
Oh, of course.
You got me going.
That's what I hope. You mentioned a few times you hope you're making sense of your Two Inside Baseball. That's exactly what I want. I like to go in depth and hopefully we reach something that isn't just kind of generic press questions and stuff like
well,
that.
I did listen to one of your podcasts, and I
oh, thank you.
That's why I agreed to do it, because I like the way you're doing it. So congratulations, good luck.
Oh yeah, it's still growing.
Yeah,
we'll see where it goes. But thanks for talking, Jeff. Right? I think Jeff and I hit it off. It was a good talk. I'm excited for this one, to post this one. So next week on the show, who's on? I don't know. Rhymed. Yeah, so it's still kind of up in the air. So there will most likely be a show next week. If not, hey, we're all human. We miss some weeks. Haven't missed a week yet, but whatever. I'm working though. I'm working to get 1 or 2 people on. So there hopefully and most likely will be a show next week. But who it'll be a surprise. But you can keep up on all the various channels, because I usually share who's going to be on the next day. The show posts on Tuesday. I usually share on Monday who's going to be on. So you can keep up with all that stuff on Facebook, Butterfly Effect Podcast, YouTube, Butterfly Effect Podcast, Twitter at Butterfly Pod. You can follow me on Twitter at Ettletod, ETTLETODD. And you can email me at trettleman@gmail.com, trettleman@gmail.com. And for feedback, suggestions, whatever. And I do really like the suggestions thing. I really want to drive that point home, because recently I interviewed Richard Vreeland, a.k.a. Disaster Piece, who I was vaguely familiar with, but who hadn't crossed my mind as someone to get on the show until a friend of mine tweeted something along the lines of, "Hey, Tristan," adding me, of course, "you should talk to Rich," atting Rich, of course. And I'm like, oh yeah, and I looked at his bio, and I'm like, oh yeah, I know who he is, and looked for his emailed him, and there we go. And that ended up being a really good conversation. So what I'm saying is, I want you guys to do the work for me and tell me who I should talk to. Because I'm kind of in my own wheelhouse. I interview people that I'm very familiar with, or that come to my mind initially. But there's a ton of people that I really enjoy their work and appreciate and respect, that aren't necessarily just coming into my head. So there's so many creative people out there, and other people's tastes and interests would serve me well. So, tweet at me, email me, just let me know who should be on the show. So, I'd appreciate it. Of course, the podcast is on iTunes. You can subscribe there, like and or whatever the thing is, rate and review. I don't know. I'm really bad at that kind of stuff. I always ask people to do stuff like that, like rate and review. I'm like, I don't ever do that when people ask me to do that on podcasts. Maybe I should do that now. Put forth some good karma into the world. And then, of course, it's hosted on Spreaker, so you can check it out there if you'd like. All right, I think that's it. That's all the stuff. I'm gonna go post this. This is me in the past. You're hearing it in the future from where I'm at right now. So isn't that interesting? All right. Talk to you later.